Everyone knows how Nazi Germany ended, but almost no one understands the economic machine that made it possible. The international community failed to enforce the very treaty designed to keep Germany weak after World War I, and the man leading the country was even elevated to Time magazine's Man of the Year, a symbol of how completely the world misread what was happening. And foreign capital kept the gears turning long before anyone understood what those gears were building. So here's the real question. If a regime can rise from a treaty meant to hold it down, what actually drove that rise? A supposed miracle, or the capital that made it possible?
Welcome to Late Economics, where economics becomes clear through the ideas and moments that shaped our world. Subscribe for more.
There's a photograph from 1938. It shows a factory floor in Rüsselsheim, Germany. Modern machinery, assembly lines, workers in clean uniforms building automobiles with precision that would impress any industrial engineer. The factory is Opel, one of Germany's largest automotive manufacturers. And if you look closely at the corporate structure, you find something interesting. Opel was wholly owned by General Motors, an American corporation. The factory, the machinery, the production capacity, all built with American capital and American technology. This isn't unusual for the period. Ford had a factory in Cologne. Standard Oil had licensing agreements for synthetic fuel production. General Electric provided turbine technology. ITT built communications infrastructure. American and British corporations were deeply embedded in Germany's industrial base throughout the 1930s. And they remained embedded even as Germany rearmed, even as Hitler consolidated power, even as the path toward war became increasingly clear. This raises an economic question that has nothing to do with politics and everything to do with structure. When we talk about Nazi Germany's rapid industrialization, the economic miracle that brought Germany from collapse in 1933 to a formidable industrial power by 1939, what are we actually describing? Hitler's genius for economic management, or a pre-existing industrial infrastructure built with foreign capital and technology that Hitler inherited and redirected toward military production? Tonight, we're going to examine that question, not as a political judgment, not as an ideological statement, as economic history. We're going to trace the flow of capital, the transfer of technology, the networks of industrial cooperation that connected Wall Street, the City of London, and German industry long before Hitler came to power. We're going to look at who financed what, who profited when, and who paid the ultimate price. Because this is a story about economic mechanisms, about how international finance operates, about how corporations pursue profit across borders, regardless of political systems, about how infrastructure built for one purpose can be repurposed for another, and about the consequences when those who build systems face no accountability for how those systems are used. This isn't about villains. It's about structure. And structure, as we'll see, can be far more consequential than any individual actor. Let's address the myth directly. Hitler built the Nazi economy alone. The economic miracle of 1933 to 1939 was his achievement. You've heard this framing in documentaries, in historical accounts that focus on Nazi economic policy, autobahn construction, employment programs. The narrative goes, Germany was destroyed in 1933, 6 million unemployed, industrial collapse, financial ruin. Then Hitler took power, and within 6 years, Germany had full employment, modern infrastructure, and industrial capacity that could sustain a war across multiple continents. The implication, Hitler was an economic genius. Or at minimum, his regime discovered some formula for rapid industrialization that defied conventional economics. Here's what that narrative omits. The infrastructure wasn't built between 1933 and 1939. It was built between 1924 and 1929. With American money, American technology, American patents, American management practices, and it remained operational, largely intact, through the economic crisis of 1929-1933. So when Hitler took power in 1933, he didn't inherit ruins. He inherited modern factories built with foreign investment, technology licensed from American corporations, production capacity that had been idled by economic depression, but not destroyed, industrial networks connecting German firms to international partners. What Hitler did was activate this existing capacity and redirect it toward military production. That's not a miracle. That's using infrastructure that someone else built. Let's be specific about the money. The Dawes Plan, 1924. After World War I and the hyperinflation crisis, Germany needed capital to stabilize its economy and pay reparations. American banks, led by J.P. Morgan, with support from the Federal Reserve and the U.S. State Department, arranged a loan structure. Total amount? Approximately $800 million initially, eventually reaching $2.5 billion in loans to Germany between 1924 and 1930. Adjusted for inflation, roughly $40 billion in 2024 terms. This wasn't charity. This was investment. American banks earned fees. American corporations gained access to German markets. German industry got modern capital equipment. Everyone profited, at least until 1929. The Young Plan, 1929, restructured Germany's debt and brought in additional capital. But here's the key mechanism. These weren't just government-to-government loans. Much of the money went directly from American banks and corporations to German industrial firms. General Motors bought Opel in 1929, invested heavily in modernizing the plant. Ford built a factory in Cologne in 1931, right in the middle of the Depression. Standard Oil formed a partnership with IG Farben for synthetic fuel technology. General Electric, ITT, IBM, all established significant operations in Germany during the 1920s and early 1930s. Why? Because Germany offered skilled labor at low cost due to currency devaluation, advanced engineering capability, a large domestic market, a strategic position in Europe, and because American corporations, flush with capital from the 1920s boom, were looking for growth opportunities abroad. This was standard industrial expansion, rational economic behavior, but it created something that would later be weaponized. Now here's where the myth really breaks down. When we say Hitler rebuilt Germany's economy, what specifically did he rebuild? He didn't build the Opel factories. GM did. He didn't develop synthetic fuel technology. Standard Oil and IG Farben did, working together. He didn't create the communications infrastructure. ITT did. He didn't design the industrial processes. American engineers working in Germany through the 1920s and 1930s did. What Hitler did was take control of a government that had regulatory authority over these industries, redirect production toward military goods, mobilize labor through a combination of employment programs and coercion, use the existing industrial base, built with foreign capital and technology, as the foundation for rearmament. The economic miracle wasn't creation, it was conversion. converting civilian production to military production, converting foreign investment into domestic war capacity, converting cooperation into conquest. And here's the part that makes this economically rather than just historically significant. The foreign corporations that built this infrastructure largely continued operating through the 1930s. General Motors' Opel plant produced trucks for the Wehrmacht. Ford's Cologne plant produced military vehicles. Standard Oil continued technology sharing with IG Farben through Swiss intermediaries even after war began. IBM's German subsidiary provided data processing equipment used in logistics and, horrifyingly, in administering concentration camps. Not because these corporations were ideologically Nazi, but because they were following economic logic: protect investments, maintain market position, maximize returns. And German contracts paid. So the myth isn't just wrong about Hitler building the economy. It's wrong about when the economy was built, who built it, and why it was built. The economy was built in the 1920s by international capital for profit. Hitler didn't create it. He inherited it and used it for purposes the original investors never intended, but also never effectively prevented. Because preventing it would have required sacrificing profits. And in the calculus of international finance, profits came first. Political consequences came later. Much later. After 70 million people were dead. Meet Dr. Friedrich Weber. He's a composite, not a real historical figure, but a realistic representation of the kind of person who would have worked in Germany's finance ministry during this period. Let's say he's 45 years old in 1933. That means he was 36 in 1924, when the Dawes Plan negotiations began. Dr. Weber has a doctorate in economics from Heidelberg. He's not political in the partisan sense. He's a technocrat. His job is to manage Germany's relationships with foreign creditors and ensure capital flows that keep the economy functioning. In 1924, he's part of the German delegation working with American bankers to structure the Dawes Plan loans. The work is technical: interest rates, collateral arrangements, payment schedules tied to Germany's industrial output. He sits across the table from representatives of J.P. Morgan & Co., from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, from the Bank of England. They're professional, courteous. They want this to work because they want Germany to be a stable trading partner and a profitable investment destination. Dr. Weber understands this clearly. The Americans aren't helping out of kindness. They're creating a structure where German recovery serves American economic interests. But that's fine. It's mutually beneficial. Germany gets capital it desperately needs. American banks get returns. American corporations get market access. Everyone wins. Also, it seems, in 1924, Dr. Weber spends the next 5 years watching American money flow into Germany. He processes loan agreements. He monitors how the capital is used. He sees Deutsche Bank borrowing to modernize operations, IG Farben, the chemical conglomerate, forming partnerships with DuPont, Standard Oil, Imperial Chemical Industries, General Motors purchasing Opel for $26 million, Ford investing $7 million to build a factory in Cologne, General Electric forming Allgemeine Elektrizitätsgesellschaft, AEG joint ventures, ITT acquiring stakes in German telecommunications. It's an enormous transfer of capital and technology. And Dr. Weber keeps meticulous records. Because his job requires understanding Germany's external obligations, who the country owes, what assets could be claimed if Germany defaults. He notices patterns. The American investments aren't just financial, they're operational. American engineers come to Germany. They bring blueprints, patents, production methods. They train German workers in American industrial techniques. They modernize factories to American efficiency standards. This is more than lending money. This is building industrial capacity. And Dr. Weber, being a careful economist, asks himself, what are we becoming dependent on? Not just American capital, that can be repaid, but American technology, American patents, American know-how. If the relationship sours, can Germany maintain this industrial capacity independently? He's not sure. But in 1928, it's not a pressing concern. The economy is growing. Employment is rising. Weimar Republic seems stable. Then 1929 happens. October. Wall Street crashes. At first, the impact on Germany seems manageable. Some volatility, some credit tightening. But by 1930, it's clear this is different. American banks start calling in short-term loans. The capital that flowed into Germany so freely for 5 years suddenly reverses. German banks, which borrowed short-term from America to lend long-term to German industry, face a crisis. They can't recall the industrial loans quickly, but they must repay the American banks. The mismatch creates stress. By 1931, it's a full crisis. July 1931. Danette Bank, one of Germany's major banks, collapses. Bank runs spread. The government closes banks temporarily. The financial system is in chaos. Dr. Weber watches the structure he helped build unravel. But here's what he notices. The financial system collapses, but the industrial system doesn't. The Opel factory is still there. The machinery works. The workers have skills. The Ford plant in Cologne is still operational. IG Farben's chemical facilities are intact. The patents, the technology, the production methods, all still exist. What's missing isn't industrial capacity. It's credit, demand, coordination. The economy has the ability to produce. It just doesn't have the financial mechanism to organize that production. Unemployment skyrockets. By 1932, 6 million Germans are out of work. Not because the factories don't exist, but because the economic system that channels demand to those factories has broken. Dr. Weber, sitting in his office in the finance ministry, understands something profound. Germany's crisis is financial, not industrial. The real assets, factories, technology, skills remain. If someone could mobilize those assets, restart demand, organize production, the economy could recover quickly. The capacity exists. It just needs activation. He doesn't know in 1932 who will do that activation. But he knows it's possible. Because the infrastructure is there, built with American money, using American technology, ready to be used. January 1933, Hitler becomes Chancellor. Dr. Weber is wary. He's not a Nazi. He's uncomfortable with the rhetoric, the violence, the scapegoating. But he's also pragmatic. His job is to manage Germany's external economic relationships, and that job continues, regardless of who's in power. Within months, he sees what Hitler's government is doing. Massive public works programs, autobahn construction, building projects. These create demand, put people back to work. But more significantly, from Dr. Weber's perspective, the government is directing demand toward heavy industry, steel, chemicals, machinery. And that heavy industry, the factories built in the 1920s with American investment, springs back to life. Opel starts producing trucks again, for road construction initially, then for military use. IG Farben's chemical plants ramp up. Synthetic materials for the growing economy. The coal mines, the steel mills, the machine shops, all the industrial infrastructure that was idled during the Depression, all reactivating. Dr. Weber processes the numbers. Industrial production is rising rapidly. Unemployment is falling. From an economic standpoint, it looks like success. But he also sees the trade data. Germany is importing raw materials at increasing rates. Iron ore from Sweden, oil from Romania. And the production isn't all civilian. He sees procurement orders, military vehicles, aircraft components, munitions. The economy is being mobilized for something. And the infrastructure making that mobilization possible? It's the infrastructure built in the 1920s. The factories built with American capital. The technology licensed from American corporations. The industrial networks that connected Germany to global supply chains. Hitler didn't build this. He inherited it. And Dr. Weber, who helped negotiate the loans that built it, feels a profound unease. Because he understands that tools are neutral. The same factory that makes civilian trucks can make military trucks. The same chemical plant that produces synthetic rubber for tires can produce materials for weapons. The same industrial capacity that creates prosperity can create destruction. It depends entirely on who controls it and for what purpose. And now, in 1933, that infrastructure is controlled by a regime that Dr. Weber doesn't trust. But there's nothing he can do. The investments were made. The factories exist. The technology is transferred. You can't uninvent industrial capacity. You can't take back knowledge. The structure is permanent, and whoever controls the state controls the structure. Dr. Weber continues his work through the 1930s. He watches foreign companies continue operating. General Motors, Ford, Standard Oil. They're still there, still profiting, still maintaining their German operations. Even as Germany rams, even as the political situation deteriorates, even as war becomes increasingly likely. Because from their perspective, this is business. Protect investments, maintain market presence, maximize returns. The political situation is someone else's problem. And so the collaboration continues. American technology flowing to German factories. German production serving increasingly military purposes. And Dr. Weber, keeping his meticulous records, documenting the flows of capital and goods, understands that he's watching an economic structure being weaponized. Not because the original builders intended weaponization, but because they built something powerful without considering who might eventually control it. He survives through most of the war, dies in 1944, before the end, from illness. His records survive him, and decades later, historians sifting through finance ministry archives find his meticulous documentation of how American capital built the industrial infrastructure that Hitler used for conquest. Not intentionally, not maliciously, just economically rationally, with catastrophic consequences. Let's build the economic world that existed in the 1920s and early 1930s, the world that created the conditions for what came later. We need to understand 5 distinct phases. Phase 1, 1918 to 1923. Collapse. Germany after World War I is economically destroyed. The Versailles Treaty imposes reparations, 132 billion gold marks, an impossible sum. To try to pay, the German government prints money. The result? Hyperinflation. In January 1922, $1 buys 191 German marks, By November 1923, $1 buys 4.2 trillion marks. Savings are wiped out. The middle class is destroyed. Industrial production collapses to 55% of pre-war levels. Workers are paid twice a day, at lunch and evening, so they can buy food before prices rise again. People carry money in wheelbarrows. A loaf of bread costs billions of marks. This isn't just economic catastrophe, it's social disintegration. The currency, the basic unit of economic coordination, has lost all meaning. And when money doesn't work, economies revert to barter, hoarding, and survival mode. Germany's industrial capacity still exists physically. The factories haven't been destroyed. But without a functioning currency, without credit, without trust, that capacity is useless. You can't organize complex industrial production when money is worthless. Phase 2, 1924 to 1929, Rebuilding. The Dawes Plan, 1924, is designed to solve two problems. 1. Stabilize Germany's currency and economy so reparations can be paid. 2. Create profitable investment opportunities for American capital. The mechanism. American banks, led by J.P. Morgan, lend money to Germany. Germany uses some of this money to pay reparations to Britain and France. Britain and France use those reparations to pay war debts to the United States. The money circulates. Everyone benefits from the circulation. But critically, not all the money goes to reparations. A substantial portion goes to German industry, for modernization, for new equipment, for expansion. And this is where American corporations enter. General Motors sees opportunity in Germany, advanced engineering, skilled workers, large market. In 1929, GM buys Opel for $26 million. Why? Because Opel is Germany's largest car maker and GM wants European market share. They invest heavily. Modern assembly lines, American production techniques, technology transfer. By 1935, the Opel plant in Rüsselsheim is producing 120,000 vehicles annually. That's more than any other GM facility outside the United States. Ford follows similar logic. In 1925, Ford opens a sales office in Berlin. In 1931, right in the middle of the global depression, Ford builds a factory in Cologne. Investment, $7 million. Why invest during a depression? Because assets are cheap. Labor is cheap. And Ford is thinking long-term. Germany will recover, and when it does, Ford will have market position. The factory produces cars, trucks, and parts. By 1935, employment, 4,000 workers. Standard Oil's relationship with IG Farben is
more complex. IG Farben is a chemical conglomerate formed in 1925 from a merger of 6 German chemical companies. It's enormous, controls 90% of German chemical production, and it's interested in synthetic fuel. Germany lacks natural petroleum, but it has coal, and coal can be converted to synthetic petroleum through hydrogenation. IG Farben develops the technology, but it needs refining expertise and access to global markets. Standard Oil has both. In 1929, they form a partnership. Standard Oil gets access to synthetic fuel patents. IG Farben gets refining expertise and market access. It's mutually beneficial. Both companies profit. But it also creates dependency. Germany's synthetic fuel capacity, which will be critical for military operations in the coming war, is built on technology shared with an American corporation. General Electric's involvement is different again. GE doesn't acquire German companies outright. Instead, it forms joint ventures and licensing agreements. With AEG, GE shares turbine technology, electrical engineering methods, and manufacturing processes. Why? Because Germany's electrical grid is expanding. There's demand for power generation equipment, and GE wants a share of that market. ITT follows similar logic with German telecommunications, acquiring stakes in German telephone companies, providing switching technology, building infrastructure. By 1933, American corporations have deep operational involvement in Germany's industrial economy, not just as investors, as operators. They're making management decisions, transferring technology, training workers. The industrial capacity being built is, in a very real sense, American-German hybrid infrastructure, financed by American capital, using American technology, but located in Germany and employing German workers. This matters because when political control shifts, the infrastructure doesn't disappear. It just falls under new management. Phase 3, 1929 to 1933. Crisis. October 1929, Wall Street crashes. Within months, American banks that had been lending freely to Germany reverse course. Short-term loans are called in, new lending stops. German banks, which borrowed short from America to lend long to German industry, face impossible demands. They can't get the money back from industrial loans quickly, but they must repay American creditors. The pressure builds through 1930 and early 1931. July 1931, Danat Bank collapses. This triggers bank runs across Germany. People rush to withdraw deposits. Banks close. The government imposes emergency measures, capital controls, bank holidays. But the damage is done. Credit freezes. Businesses can't get loans. Orders dry up. Unemployment explodes. By early 1932, 6 million Germans are unemployed. That's roughly 30% of the workforce. Industrial production falls to 60% of 1928 levels. But, and this is critical, the factories still exist. The Opel plant is there. The machinery works. The workers have skills. It's just idle because there's no demand, no credit, no way to organize production. The crisis is one of coordination, not capacity. And politically, this creates opportunity for extremes. The centrist parties, Social Democrats, Centre Party, moderates, are associated with the Weimar system, and the Weimar system is clearly failing. Unemployment, poverty, desperation. People look for alternatives. The communists gain support on the left, the Nazis gain support on the right. Both promise radical change. Both blame the existing system, and the existing system has few defenders because it's not working. Elections in July 1932. Nazis become the largest party. Elections in November 1932. They remain the largest party, despite losing some seats. January 1933. Political maneuvering, backroom deals. Conservative politicians think they can control Hitler. He becomes Chancellor. Phase 4, 1933 to 1939. Conversion. Hitler's economic program is often described as if it were novel, but structurally, it's straightforward. Massive deficit spending on public works and rearmament. This creates demand. Demand creates employment. Employment creates consumer spending. The economy recovers. Keynesian economics, essentially, though Hitler would never acknowledge that. But here's what makes Germany's recovery different from, say, Roosevelt's New Deal. The industrial infrastructure already exists, and it's modern, efficient, built with American technology in the 1920s. So when demand returns, production can scale up rapidly. The Opel plant, idle in 1932, is running multiple shifts by 1935, producing trucks, initially for civilian use, construction, delivery, then increasingly for military logistics. IG Farben's chemical plants ramp up synthetic fuel production, not because new technology was developed, because the technology licensed from Standard Oil in 1929 is put to full use. By 1939, Germany produces 72 million barrels of synthetic fuel annually. That's 46% of total oil consumption. Without that capacity, built on American-German collaboration in the 1920s, Germany's military mobilization would have been impossible. You can't run an air force or mechanized army without fuel, and Germany lacks natural petroleum. Synthetic fuel, made possible by technology shared with Standard Oil, solves that problem. Ford's Cologne plant expands production. By 1938, 60,000 vehicles annually. Many are trucks for military use. Ford-branded vehicles rolling off German assembly lines destined for the Wehrmacht. ITT's telecommunications infrastructure becomes critical for military communications. The equipment ITT provided in the 1920s and early 1930s is used to coordinate military operations. And through all of this, the American corporations remain involved. Not uniformly, not enthusiastically in all cases, but they remain present. Because Germany is still a profitable market, and because pulling out means abandoning investments, market share, and future prospects. So they navigate. GM maintains operational control of Opel through 1940. Ford continues production in Cologne through the war. Standard Oil maintains technical exchanges with IG Farben through Swiss intermediaries, even after the US enters the war. The boundaries between business and politics blur. Are these companies complicit in Germany's militarization? In a structural sense, yes. Their infrastructure enables it. In an intentional sense, it's complex. They're following economic logic. Protect investments, maintain market position. They're not making political decisions to support the Nazi regime, but their economic decisions have political consequences, and they benefit from those consequences. Phase 5, 1939 to 1945. Consequences. September 1939. Germany invades Poland. The war that the industrial infrastructure helped make possible begins. Over the next 6 years, 70 million people die, the highest death toll of any conflict in human history. 6 million Jews are murdered in the Holocaust. Systematic, industrial-scale genocide. Millions more, Romani, disabled people, political prisoners, Soviet POWs, others, are killed in concentration camps. Entire cities are destroyed. Dresden, Hamburg, Warsaw, Stalingrad. And the industrial infrastructure that enabled this, much of it survives. Allied bombing targets factories. Many are damaged, but many survive or are rebuilt quickly. And after the war, those same American corporations that operated in Germany through the 1930s, they return, reclaim their investments, resume operations. General Motors reclaims Opel. Ford reclaims the Cologne plant.
They receive compensation from the US government for damage to their German facilities during Allied bombing. Let that sink in. American corporations, whose German subsidiaries produced for the Wehrmacht, received compensation from the US government for war damage. The economic logic completes its circle. Invest in the 1920s. Profit in the 1930s. Weather the war.
Recover and profit in the 1950s. The system, from an investor perspective, works. From a human perspective, 70 million dead. Now let's dig into the specific mechanisms. The everyday economic realities that connected Wall Street boardrooms to German factory floors. This is where economic history gets granular. Strand 1. The Prescott-Bush connection. Prescott Bush, father of George H.W. Bush, grandfather of George W. Bush, was a partner at Brown Brothers Harriman, one of Wall Street's most prestigious investment banks. In the 1920s and 1930s, Brown Brothers Harriman had extensive German dealings. More specifically, Prescott Bush was a director of Union Banking Corporation. Union Banking was essentially a US financial conduit for Fritz Thyssen, a German steel magnate who was an early financial supporter of the Nazi Party. Thyssen's steel empire was consolidated under Vereinigte Stahlwerke, United Steel Works, which became one of Germany's largest industrial conglomerates. Union Banking held shares in Thyssen's enterprises and facilitated financial transactions between German industry and American investors. This continued through the 1930s. It wasn't until October 1942, nearly a year after the US entered World War II, that the US government invoked the Trading with the Enemy Act and seized Union Banking's assets. Prescott Bush's involvement wasn't illegal at the time the transactions occurred, and there's no evidence he was ideologically Nazi. He was doing what investment bankers do, facilitating capital flows between investors and profitable enterprises. But the structure he helped operate funneled American capital to German industry that was rearming under Hitler. And after the war, when the government returned seized assets, the Bush family's investments had held their value. They didn't lose money on Nazi Germany. They profited, not spectacularly, but profitably. While millions died, the financial structures that enabled the war remained economically viable for their American investors. Strand 2. IG Farben's global network. IG Farben deserves special attention because it illustrates how deeply integrated German and Allied economies were even as they prepared for war. IG Farben was a cartel. 6 major German chemical companies merged in 1925. BASF, Bayer, Hoechst, Agfa, Casella, Kaller combined, they controlled 90% of German chemical production. But IG Farben wasn't just German. It had partnership agreements, patent sharing arrangements, and joint ventures with Standard Oil, US, DuPont, US, Imperial Chemical Industries, UK, Kuhlmann, France, Mitsui, Japan. These weren't casual relationships. The Standard Oil partnership, formalized in 1929, covered synthetic rubber and synthetic fuel. IG Farben had developed hydrogenation, turning coal into petroleum. Standard Oil had refining expertise and global distribution networks. They agreed to share technology. IG Farben got Standard's refining patents. Standard got IG Farben's synthetic fuel patents. The partnership included provisions that if either company developed improvements, they'd share those too. This continued into the war. Even after Germany and the US were enemies, technical information flowed through Swiss intermediaries. Standard Oil's official position was that contractual obligations required technology sharing. The practical reality, both companies benefited. IG Farben got refining improvements. Standard got synthetic fuel know-how that would be valuable post-war. Business over politics. Now, IG Farben's role in the war and Holocaust. IG Farben operated a synthetic rubber plant at Auschwitz. The plant used slave labor from the concentration camp. An estimated 25 to 30,000 workers died from exhaustion, malnutrition, and brutal working conditions at the Buna Vrka plant. After the war, IG Farben executives were prosecuted at Nuremberg. 13 were convicted. Sentences ranged from 18 months to 8 years. Most were released early and resumed business careers. The company was broken up into its original components, BASF, Bayer, Hoechst, etc. Those companies exist today as major multinational corporations. The American companies that partnered with IG Farben, Standard Oil, now ExxonMobil, and DuPont continued operations without interruption. No prosecutions, no significant penalties, because from a legal perspective, they were separate corporate entities. The fact that they shared technology with a company that used slave labor was, in the post-war settlement, treated as a contractual matter rather than a criminal one. Strand 3. GM and Ford's truck production. Let's talk about vehicles. Modern warfare in the 1930s and 1940s required motorization. Tanks, yes, but even more importantly, trucks. Trucks move supplies, troops, ammunition, food, fuel. Germany's military mobility depended on trucks, and German truck production in the 1930s was dominated by American-owned companies. General Motors' Opel division produced trucks throughout the 1930s. The Opel Blitz, a 3-ton truck, became one of the Wehrmacht's standard vehicles. Over 100,000 Opel Blitz trucks were produced during the war. They were used on every front, in France, in Russia, in North Africa. Ford's plant in Cologne produced similar vehicles. The Ford Vrka company was technically a German subsidiary, but it was wholly owned by Ford Motor Company in Dearborn, Michigan. Ford Vrka produced trucks and light vehicles for military use throughout the war. By 1943, at the height of production, Ford Vrka employed 4,000 workers producing vehicles for the Wehrmacht. Now, the corporate relationship gets murky during the war. Ford in the US claimed it lost control of Ford Vrka after the US entered the war in December 1941. German management took operational control, but Ford retained ownership. And after the war, Ford reclaimed the subsidiary and received compensation for bombing damage. Approximately $1 million from the US government. So, Ford's German subsidiary produces trucks for the Wehrmacht. Allied bombers damage the plant. The US government compensates Ford for the damage. From a pure economic logic perspective, it makes sense. Ford is an American company. US policy is to compensate American companies for war damage. But it creates a perverse outcome. The company profits from both sides of the war. Strand 4. Forced labor and American subsidiaries. This is the darkest strand. German industry during the war relied heavily on forced labor. Prisoners of war, concentration camp inmates, civilians from occupied territories, forced to work in factories, mines, farms. Estimates vary, but at least 12 million people were used as forced laborers by German industry during the war. Many died from exhaustion, starvation, disease, or outright murder. American-owned subsidiaries in Germany used forced laborers. Ford Vrka used forced labor. Records show Russian and French prisoners of war working in the Cologne plant.
Opel used forced labour. GM's post-war investigation acknowledged this occurred. ITT's German operations used forced labour. Were the American parent companies aware? This is contested. During the war, communication between US headquarters and German subsidiaries was difficult or impossible. German managers made operational decisions, but the subsidiaries existed because American companies chose to maintain operations in Germany through the 1930s, even as the political direction became clear. After the war, victims of forced labour sought compensation. Some cases were settled. In 2000, German companies and the German government created a fund, 10 billion Deutschmarks, about $5 billion, for forced labour compensation. American companies with German subsidiaries contributed, but minimally. Ford contributed $13 million. GM contributed indirectly through Opel. The amounts were small relative to company revenues and profits, and the legal settlements explicitly stated that contributions were not admissions of guilt. From a corporate perspective, limited liability. Business decisions made by subsidiaries during extraordinary circumstances. From a human perspective, slave labour, suffering, death, and minimal accountability. Strand 5. Raw materials. The Swedish iron ore question. Germany's war machine required iron ore for steel, for weapons, for vehicles, for everything. But Germany's domestic iron ore supplies were limited and low grade. The solution? Sweden. Sweden had vast high-grade iron ore deposits in the north, near Kiruna and Gällivare, and Sweden was neutral. Throughout the war, Sweden sold iron ore to Germany. The ore was shipped through the port of Narvik, Norway, until Norway was occupied, then directly through the Baltic. In 1943, at the height of the war, Sweden exported 10 million tons of iron ore to Germany. That's nearly 40% of Germany's total iron ore supply. Without Swedish iron, Germany's war production would have been severely constrained. Why did Sweden sell to Germany? Economic pressure. Germany was Sweden's largest trading partner. Political pressure. Germany could have invaded. Sweden's neutrality depended on accommodation. And profit. The iron ore trade was lucrative. Swedish companies LKAB, Luossavaara Kirunavaara AB, and others made substantial profits selling to Germany. Some of those companies had international investors, including American and British capital. So Allied investors indirectly profited from ore sales that sustained Germany's war machine. Not directly, not illegally, but structurally, capital flowed from iron ore sales to Swedish companies to international investors, while the iron became weapons that killed Allied soldiers. This is the complexity of global economic networks. No single actor is fully responsible, but the system as a whole produces outcomes that no one intended, but everyone contributed to. Strand 6. Swiss banking and gold transactions. Switzerland's role as neutral banker enabled Germany's war economy in crucial ways. Germany looted gold from occupied countries, from central banks, from victims of the Holocaust. That gold had to be converted to currency to buy raw materials from neutral countries. Swiss banks facilitated this. The Bank for International Settlements, BIS, based in Basel, Switzerland, acted as a clearinghouse for transactions between Axis and Allied central banks throughout the war. The president of BIS during part of the war, an American, Thomas McKittrick. The BIS board included representatives from Germany, Italy, Britain, and the US. Even during the war, they met and facilitated financial transactions. Why? The official rationale: maintaining the international financial system's infrastructure for post-war reconstruction. The practical effect: enabling Germany to convert looted gold into currency for war material purchases. After the war, investigations revealed that Swiss banks handled approximately $400 million in gold from Nazi sources. Much of it was looted. Some of it came from Holocaust victims. Jewelry, dental fillings, personal possessions melted down. Swiss banks claimed they didn't know the origin. That's implausible. The quantities were enormous. The sources were obviously questionable, but banks are legally obligated to their depositors, not to the origins of deposits. So the transactions proceeded. And after the war, Switzerland resisted returning looted gold for decades. Eventually, settlements were reached, but they took 50+ years of negotiation. The banks profited from wartime transactions and faced minimal accountability. Strand 7. The IBM Hollerith machine question. This strand is technical but horrifying. IBM had a German subsidiary, der HOMAG, Deutsche Hollerith Maschinengesellschaft. Hollerith machines were early data processing devices: punch cards, sorting, tabulation. They were used for census data, business records, logistics. Nazi Germany used Hollerith machines extensively for census operations that identified Jewish populations, for railroad logistics that transported people to concentration camps, for camp administration that tracked prisoners. The technology wasn't designed for genocide, but it was applied to genocide. And IBM's German subsidiary provided the machines, the maintenance, the punch cards, the technical support. Was IBM corporate headquarters in New York aware? Edwin Black's book, IBM and the Holocaust, argues yes, based on corporate correspondence and technical support documentation. IBM's official position is that de HOMAG operated independently during the war, and IBM lost control. What's clear? The machines existed in Germany because IBM established operations there in the 1920s. The machines were maintained and supplied throughout the 1930s and into the war years, and they were used for operations that killed millions. After the war, IBM resumed German operations. No prosecutions of IBM executives, no major financial penalties, because legally the subsidiary was a separate entity, and technology is neutral. How it's used is the user's responsibility. But that neutrality argument is cold comfort to the victims. Now let's step back and identify the core economic mechanism that allowed all of this to happen. It's not conspiracy. It's not coordination among corporations to support evil. It's something more mundane and more structural. The separation of economic logic from political consequence. Here's how it works. Mechanism 1. Capital seeks return, regardless of regime. In the 1920s, American banks and corporations had capital to invest. Germany needed capital and offered opportunities: skilled labor, engineering capability, market access. The investments were economically rational, but they created infrastructure that could be repurposed. When political control changed in 1933, the economic structure remained, and capital, having been invested, had an interest in protecting that investment, which meant maintaining operations even as the regime changed, because pulling out means writing off the investment. So corporations stayed, not
not because they supported Nazis, but because leaving was costly. Mechanism 2. Technology transfer is irreversible. When Standard Oil shared synthetic fuel technology with IG Farben in 1929, that knowledge became permanent. You can't unteach something. The patents were registered, the processes documented, the expertise developed. And once expertise exists, it can be applied to any purpose. Synthetic fuel for civilian vehicles? Sure. Synthetic fuel for military aircraft? Same technology. The transfer happened for profit in peacetime, but the knowledge enabled war. And there's no mechanism to reverse technology transfer when circumstances change. Mechanism 3. Subsidiaries create legal separation. When GM bought Opel, it created a German subsidiary, legally distinct, German management, German workers, German operations. This provided tax advantages, limited liability, regulatory compliance, but it also created distance. When Opel produced trucks for the Wehrmacht, GM could claim, "That's Opel's decision. They're a German company. We don't control day-to-day operations." Legally true, but Opel existed because GM chose to invest in Germany. The subsidiary structure protected the parent company from legal and reputational consequences, while allowing continued profit from German operations. Mechanism 4. Neutral countries enable circumvention. Sweden's iron ore, Switzerland's banking, Spanish tungsten, Portuguese wolfram. Neutral countries provided materials and services that sustained Germany's war economy. They did this legally. Neutrality means trading with both sides, but neutrality also meant profit, and those profits often flowed to international investors, creating a layer of separation between the war's conduct and the capital that benefited from it. Mechanism 5. Post-war reconstruction rewards continuity. After the war, Germany needed rebuilding. Who had the expertise, capital, and existing infrastructure to participate? The same companies that operated there before and during the war. GM reclaimed Opel. Ford reclaimed the Cologne plant. Chemical companies resumed operations. They argued, "We're providing employment, rebuilding the economy, supporting recovery." All true. But it also meant they recaptured market position and resumed profitability, with minimal accountability for wartime activities. The system rewarded those who stayed invested through the war, not those who divested on principle. Mechanism 6. Limited liability protects capital. After the war, some German executives were prosecuted, Krupp executives, IG Farben executives, others, but executives of American parent companies, not prosecuted, because legally they weren't responsible for subsidiary operations. The corporate structure insulated them, and even the German executives who were convicted served relatively short sentences. Most were released by the mid-1950s and resumed business careers. The system of limited liability, designed to encourage investment by capping risk, also limited accountability for consequences. The overarching pattern. Each mechanism individually is neutral or even beneficial in normal economic contexts. Capital mobility creates efficiency. Technology transfer spreads innovation. Subsidiaries enable international business. Neutral trade supports economic stability. Post-war reconstruction is necessary. Limited liability encourages risk-taking. But when combined in extraordinary circumstances, these mechanisms create a structure where capital can flow to any regime. Technology can be transferred to any purpose.
Legal structures protect investors from consequences, and those who profit face minimal accountability. This isn't evil genius, it's banal economics. And that's what makes it so troubling, because it means the same mechanisms are operating today. Capital still seeks return regardless of regime. Technology still transfers irreversibly. Subsidiaries still create legal distance, and investors still face limited accountability for how their capital is used. The structure that enabled financing Nazi Germany's industrial rise, it's still the structure of global capitalism, just applied to different contexts.
Let's talk about who paid the price. Because economic systems have human consequences, and the consequences of this system were catastrophic. Pain point 1. The German worker's dilemma. A man, let's call him Klaus, works at the Opel plant in Rüsselsheim. He's 35 years old in 1936, has a wife and 2 children. He was unemployed from 1930 to 1934, 4 years of desperation. The family nearly starved. In 1934, the Opel plant starts hiring again. Klaus gets a job, assembly line work, building trucks. The pay is decent, not great, but enough. The family eats regularly. The children go to school. Life stabilizes. Klaus doesn't ask too many questions about where the trucks go. He knows some are for military use. That's concerning. But what's he supposed to do? Quit? If he quits, another man takes his job. The trucks still get built, but Klaus's family goes hungry. He's not political. He's not a Nazi. He doesn't hate Jews or want war, but he works in a system that builds machines for war, and he has no good options. By 1942, Klaus notices changes. New workers at the plant. They're not German. They're prisoners. Russian, French, Polish. They're thin, guarded, clearly not working voluntarily. Klaus knows this is wrong, but speaking up means arrest, possibly death. Staying silent means being complicit. He chooses silence, keeps his head down, focuses on his family's survival. Is Klaus responsible for what the trucks are used for? Legally, no. Morally, it's complicated. He didn't create the system. He's surviving within it, but his labor enables the system to function. This is the banality of complicity. Not malice, not ideology, just economic necessity combined with limited options. And millions of people faced versions of this choice. Pain point 2. The forced laborer. A young woman, call her Sophia, is from Poland. In 1942, she's 19. Her village is occupied. She's taken, along with hundreds of others, to Germany for forced labor. She ends up at a Ford Werker facility near Cologne. The conditions are brutal. 12-hour shifts, minimal food, no medical care. Guards beat workers who slow down. She assembles parts for military trucks. She's not paid. She's a prisoner. She watches people die, some from exhaustion, some from beatings, some from disease. The factory is bombed in 1944. Many workers die in the bombing. Sophia survives, barely. In 1945, the war ends. She's liberated, weighs 80 pounds, has permanent health damage. She returns to Poland, tries to rebuild her life. Decades later, in the 1990s, she hears about compensation programs. She applies, provides testimony, waits. In 2001, she receives a payment from the German Forced Labor Compensation Fund. The amount? 7,500 Deutsche Marks, about $3,500, for 2 years of slavery, for permanent health damage, for trauma that lasts a lifetime. The payment is described as a humanitarian gesture, not legal compensation. No admission of guilt from the companies that used her labor. Sophia takes the money. It's something, but it doesn't feel like justice. Pain point 3. The Holocaust victim. A man, we'll call him David, lives in Poland in 1940. He's Jewish. The Nazis force him into a ghetto. Then, in 1943, he's transported to Auschwitz. At Auschwitz, there's selection. Some are sent immediately to gas chambers. Others are selected for labor. David is healthy, strong. He's sent to work at the IG Farben synthetic rubber plant, Bühnewerke. The work is back-breaking, building a massive industrial facility, carrying materials, digging, construction. The conditions kill people daily. Exhaustion, starvation, beatings. David survives 3 months, then dysentery, too weak to work. He's sent back to Birkenau, gassed. His labour contributed to building a plant that IG Farben intended to use for profit. After the war, IG Farben executives are prosecuted. Some go to prison for a few years. The company is broken up. But the successor companies, BASF, Bayer, Herscht, inherit the assets. They become major multinational corporations. David's family receives no compensation because he died, and the compensation programs come decades later, long after most direct victims have died. Pain point 4. The Allied soldier. A young American soldier, call him John, lands in Normandy in June 1944. He's 20 years old, from Ohio, drafted. As his unit advances into France, they face German troops transported in Opel trucks. The trucks are built by GM, an American company. John doesn't know this. He just knows they're getting shot at. In late June, his unit is ambushed, an artillery barrage. John is hit. He survives but loses his left leg below the knee. He's sent home, receives a Purple Heart, a pension. He struggles with PTSD, phantom pain, difficulty finding work that accommodates his disability. Decades later, he reads about GM's wartime operations in Germany. The trucks that transported the troops who shot him were built by an American company, a company that received compensation from the US government for war damage to its German facilities. John feels a complicated anger, not at the soldiers, they were following orders, but at the system that created a scenario where an American company built vehicles for the enemy that killed and wounded American soldiers, and then got compensated for it. He writes letters to GM, to congressmen, to newspapers. He gets polite responses, explanations about corporate structure, wartime circumstances, legal separations, but no accountability. Pain point 5. The unintended beneficiaries. Prescott Bush, after the war, has a successful career. He becomes a US Senator from Connecticut, serves from 1952 to 1963. His son, George H.W. Bush, becomes president. His grandson, George W. Bush, becomes president. The family wealth, built partly on investments that included financing German industry, compounds over generations.
They're not villains. They didn't intend to finance atrocities, but they benefited from a system that did and faced no consequences. Similarly, executives and shareholders of companies that operated in Nazi Germany, they didn't lose their fortunes. Many became wealthier post-war as their companies resumed operations and German markets recovered. The system rewarded those who stayed invested, while those who suffered, forced laborers, Holocaust victims, soldiers, received minimal or no compensation. This is the distributive outcome. Profits flowed upward to capital. Costs flowed downward to labor and to victims. And the legal and economic structures ensured that this distribution persisted even after the war ended. The crisis isn't 1945. That's when the consequences culminated. The crisis is earlier. The structural crisis is 1929 to 1933, because that's when choices were made, or more accurately, when default economic logic prevailed, that set everything in motion. Let's trace the critical failure points. Failure point 1, July 1931, the banking crisis. When Danette Bank collapsed and German banks faced runs, there was a choice. American banks could have A. Restructured German debt, provided stabilization loans, supported the Weimar government. B. Called in loans, protected their own balance sheets, let Germany's financial system collapse. They chose B, not maliciously, but rationally from a banker's perspective. When risk increases, you pull back. You protect your position. But this choice had consequences. It accelerated Germany's economic spiral. It created the desperation that made extremism appealing. It weakened the Weimar government at the moment it most needed stability. Economic logic, sound. Political consequence, catastrophic. Failure point 2, 1933 to 1934. The decision to stay. When Hitler came to power in 1933, American corporations faced a choice: continue operating in Germany or divest on principle. Most chose to stay because the investments were substantial. The Nazi regime was courting foreign business. The economic situation was improving. And pulling out meant competitors, British, French, other American firms, would take your market share. Economic logic, rational. Moral logic, questionable. But corporations aren't moral actors. They're economic actors. They follow incentives, and the incentives favored staying. Failure point 3, 1938, the Kristallnacht moment. November 1938, Kristallnacht. Organized pogroms across Germany. Synagogues burned. Jewish businesses destroyed. Jews arrested en masse. This was unmistakably clear evidence of the regime's character. Some companies began pulling back, but most stayed, because by 1938, their operations were deeply embedded. Exits would be costly, and the regime was still paying its bills. Business continued, not because executives were Nazis, but because the economic logic of sunk costs, market position, and profitability outweighed moral considerations. Firebase point 4, 1939 to 1941, the neutrality period. After war began in September 1939, American companies had nearly 2.5 years before the US entered the war. During this period, trade with Germany was still legal. Some continued, through subsidiaries, through neutral countries,
through creative legal structures. The US government didn't stop it. Neutrality laws allowed trade, and companies followed what was legal, not what was right. The core crisis. Each failure point represents a moment where economic logic prevailed over political foresight. No single decision was illegal, or even, strictly speaking, irrational from a business perspective. But cumulatively, they created a system where international capital built industrial capacity in Germany in the 1920s. That capacity survived the Depression. Hitler inherited it in 1933. Foreign companies stayed invested, protecting their capital. The infrastructure was converted to military production, and by the time anyone recognized the full consequences, it was too late to reverse. The tragedy is this: the system was built by people trying to make money, not trying to enable genocide, not trying to start a war, just trying to profit from investment opportunities in a recovering economy. But the infrastructure they built served purposes they never intended, and the mechanisms that protected their investments also shielded them from accountability. The crisis isn't that evil people did evil things. The crisis is that normal economic behavior, pursued by people acting rationally within their roles, produced catastrophic outcomes. And the structure of global capitalism enabled this, not maliciously, but functionally, because capital flows to opportunity, technology transfers to profit, investments persist to protect returns, and consequences are externalized to those without capital. 70 million people died, 6 million Jews murdered, millions more enslaved, starved, worked to death. And the investors? Most recovered their capital. Many profited. This is the crisis. Not that it happened, but that the system allowed it to happen, and that fundamentally the same system still operates today. Dr. Weber sits in his office in late 1943. It's winter in Berlin. The city is under blackout. Air raid sirens wail periodically, though tonight has been quiet so far. His office is cold. Coal Russians have been cut again. He works in his coat, gloves, without fingers, so he can still write. On his desk, stacks of reports, industrial production figures, raw material imports, railway logistics, financial flows. He's been compiling data throughout the war. It's his job. Even now, as the war turns against Germany, the finance ministry needs to track economic activity. But tonight, he's not working on official reports. He's writing something else, a private document, part analysis, part confession, part attempt to understand how everything went so wrong. He starts with the numbers from 1924, the Dawes Plan, $800 million initially, eventually $2.5 billion in American loans. He was in those meetings, 23 years old, fresh from university, junior member of the German delegation. He remembers the American bankers, confident, professional, treating the negotiations like any other investment deal. They were good at their jobs. They structured loans that were profitable for American investors and achievable for Germany. At least, achievable in theory. The money flowed, factories were built, equipment was purchased, workers were hired. By 1929, Germany's economy had recovered remarkably. Industrial production exceeded pre-war levels. Exports were growing. The currency was stable. Weber had felt proud. He'd contributed to rebuilding his country. Then, 1929, the crash. He remembers July 1931 vividly. Danert Bank collapsed on a Tuesday.
By Friday, lines at banks stretched around blocks, people desperate to withdraw savings. The government closed banks, emergency measures, capital controls. Weber worked 18-hour days trying to manage the crisis, but it was like trying to hold back a flood with his hands. The American loans were called in, credit vanished, unemployment exploded. By 1932, 6 million jobless, 30% of the workforce. Weber saw the social fabric tearing, beggars on every corner, soup kitchens overwhelmed, crime rising, political violence between communists and Nazis. The Weimar government couldn't cope, and in January 1933, Hitler became Chancellor. Weber remembers his own reaction at the time. Concern, certainly. The Nazis were thugs, their rhetoric was poisonous, but also a sliver of relief, because at least Hitler promised decisive action, mobilization, jobs, and Weber was exhausted from crisis. Part of him wanted someone, anyone, to make the chaos stop. He wasn't a Nazi, never joined the party, never attended rallies, but he also didn't resist. He kept his job, continued his work, told himself he was serving Germany, not the regime. And in a sense, that was true. His work was technical, process loans, track capital flows, manage currency reserves. The same work regardless of who was in power. But the context changed everything. In 1934, industrial production began rising. Opel plant reactivated, hiring workers. Krupp steelworks expanding, new equipment. IG Farben ramping up synthetic fuel production. Weber processed the numbers, saw employment falling, output rising. From an economic standpoint, it looked like recovery. But he also saw what the factories were producing. Trucks for military logistics, steel for armor plate, chemicals for munitions. The economy was being mobilized for war. And the infrastructure making that mobilization possible? It had been built with American capital, using American technology. Weber remembers a conversation in 1936 with an American colleague, a representative from General Motors, visiting Berlin to check on Opel operations. They met for dinner, spoke English, discussed business. The GM representative was pleased. Opel was profitable, production was up, market share was growing. Weber asked, carefully, "Do you have concerns about what the trucks are being used for?" The American shrugged. Opel produces commercial vehicles. What customers do with them is their business. We're not in the business of policing end use. Legally, that was defensible. Morally, Weber found it hollow. But he didn't press. What was the point? The system operated according to its own logic, and individual actors, whether him or the GM representative, were just executing roles within that system. Now, in 1943, Weber looks at the latest production figures. German industry is still functioning, producing tanks, aircraft, artillery at remarkable rates. But the raw materials increasingly come from desperate sources. Swedish iron ore, yes. Romania oil, yes. But also plunder from occupied territories, forced labor from concentration camps. The economy has become predatory. And Weber knows, everyone in the ministry knows, even if it's not spoken, what's happening in the camps, the transports, the selections, the extermination.
It's not his responsibility. That's what he tells himself. He's in finance, not in charge of camps, not making those decisions. But his work enables the system. The trains that transport people to camps, they run on fuel his ministry helps procure. The factories that use slave labor, they operate within economic frameworks his ministry manages. He's not pulling triggers or operating gas chambers, but he's part of the machinery, a small gear in an enormous apparatus of destruction. And the American companies, they're still there. More complicated now. Some have lost direct control of German subsidiaries due to war. But the plants operate. Opel produces trucks. Ford Verker produces vehicles. ITT equipment handles communications. The infrastructure built in the 1920s with American investment, sustained through the 1930s with American technology, now serves Nazi Germany's war machine. Weber writes in his private document, "We built this system together, American capital and German industry, thinking we were creating prosperity, thinking economics was separate from politics, that business was neutral. We were wrong. There is no neutrality in infrastructure. Infrastructure serves whoever controls it. We built factories for profit. They became weapons. We transferred technology for market access. It became military capacity. We created jobs for stability. They were turned to war production. And now, millions are dead. Millions more enslaved. Cities in ruins, a civilization destroyed. Not because we intended this, but because we didn't consider that our tools could be weaponized. Or more honestly, we considered it, but chose not to let that consideration stop us. Because there was money to be made, and money in our system trumps foresight." He pauses, stares at what he's written. He knows this document will likely never be read. He'll probably die soon. The war is going badly. Soviet armies advancing from the east. Allied bombers destroying German cities. The system he helped build is collapsing. But it did its damage first. He thinks about the workers he saw in factories, the German workers who were just trying to feed their families, the forced laborers, Poles, Russians, French, who had no choice. All of them trapped in a system that used them. And he thinks about the investors, the American bankers who loaned the money, the corporate executives who built the factories, the shareholders who profited from dividends. They're mostly safe. In New York, in London, in neutral countries. The war will end. They'll reclaim their investments, resume operations. Many will profit from post-war reconstruction. They built the system, but they won't pay for its consequences. That bill is being paid by the 70 million dead, the 12 million enslaved, the 6 million Jews murdered, the cities destroyed, the survivors traumatized. And Weber, sitting in his cold office in a dying regime, understands that he's among those who will pay. Not the biggest price. He's not in a camp, not on a battlefield, but he'll likely die before the war ends. Disease, bombing, or the chaos of collapse. And his children will inherit a destroyed country, while the investors inherit their portfolios. The asymmetry is stark. The ones who built the system survive and profit.
The ones who were used by the system die and suffer. He closes his notebook. Outside, the sirens begin. Air raid. He gathers his coat and heads to the shelter. In the dark, descending concrete stairs, joining hundreds of others huddling underground while bombers pass overhead, he thinks, this is what infrastructure becomes when it's built without accountability. This is what happens when profit is prioritized over foresight. This is what economic logic produces when divorced from human consequence. And the most terrifying part, the system will likely survive, because systems are resilient. After the war, there will be reconstruction. The same companies, the same capital flows, the same economic logic, just applied to rebuilding instead of destroying. But the structure will be the same. Capital seeking return, technology transferring to opportunity, legal mechanisms protecting investors from consequences. The lesson won't be learned, because the lesson is too costly. It would require changing the fundamental architecture of how global capitalism works, and those who benefit from that architecture will never voluntarily change it. So it will happen again. Different place, different time, different context, but the same pattern, because the pattern is structural, and structures persist. May 1945. Germany surrenders. The war in Europe ends. The scale of destruction is incomprehensible. 70 million dead globally. 6 million Jews murdered in the Holocaust. Millions more killed in camps, in bombing, in combat, from starvation and disease. Germany itself is in ruins. Major cities destroyed, infrastructure shattered. 12 million ethnic Germans expelled from Eastern Europe. The country divided. And the companies that built the industrial infrastructure, they begin the process of recovery. Immediate post-war, 1945 to 1948. General Motors files claims for war damage to its Opel facilities. The plants were bombed by Allied forces, equipment damaged, buildings destroyed. Under US government policy, American companies can claim compensation for war damage to their foreign assets. GM receives approximately $32 million in compensation. Ford receives approximately $1 million for damage to Ford Werke. Let that sink in. American companies, whose German subsidiaries produced vehicles for the Wehrmacht, receive compensation from the US government for Allied bombing damage. The government is essentially paying American companies for damage done to facilities that were used against Allied forces. It's legally sound. American companies are entitled to compensation for war damage under existing law. But morally, it's grotesque. IG Farben is prosecuted. The Nuremberg trials include a specific case. United States v. Karl Krauk et al. The IG Farben case. 24 IG Farben executives are indicted. Charges include planning aggressive war, plundering occupied territories, and enslaving workers. 13 are convicted. Sentences range from 18 months to 8 years. Most are released by 1952. Fritz Tamir, convicted of slavery and mass murder for his role in using forced labor at Auschwitz, serves 5 years. After release, he becomes chairman of the supervisory board of Bayer AG. Think about that. Convicted of slavery and mass murder, serves 5 years, then becomes chairman of one of the world's largest pharmaceutical companies. That's the level of accountability. IG Farben itself is broken up by Allied authorities in 1952, split into its original constituent companies, BASF, Bayer, Hoechst, Agfa, others. These companies continue operating. They're now major multinationals. BASF, Global Chemical Company, $76 billion revenue, 2023. Bayer, Pharmaceutical and Life Sciences Company, $48 billion revenue, 2023. Hoechst merged into Sanofi Aventis, now Sanofi, major pharmaceutical company. The legal entity of IG Farben technically still exists, though it has no operations. It's kept alive solely to handle remaining legal claims from forced labor and Holocaust victims. As of 2024, there are still pending lawsuits.
Reconstruction era, 1948 to 1960. The Marshall Plan provides $13 billion in American aid to rebuild Western Europe, about $173 billion in 2024 dollars. Much of this goes to rebuilding German industry. And who has the expertise to rebuild German industrial capacity? The same American companies that built it originally. GM resumes control of Opel, begins modernizing the plants. Ford resumes operations at Ford Werk. Chemical companies re-establish partnerships. By 1955, West Germany's economy is growing rapidly. The Wirtschaftswunder, economic miracle. But it's not really a miracle. It's the same infrastructure from the 1920s and 1930s, rebuilt with Marshall Plan money. The knowledge didn't disappear. The industrial capacity, though damaged, was reconstructable, and American capital flows again. Compensation battles, 1950s to 2000s. Forced labor victims seek compensation. Individual lawsuits, mostly unsuccessful. German companies argue forced labor was imposed by the Nazi government. The companies had no choice. Courts largely accept this. American companies with German subsidiaries argue the subsidiaries were legally distinct entities under wartime German control. Courts largely accept this too. It takes until 2000, 55 years after the war, for a comprehensive compensation fund to be established. The German government and German companies create a foundation: remembrance, responsibility, and future. Total fund, 10 billion Deutsche Marks, about $5 billion. This is to compensate all surviving forced laborers. Estimated 1.5 million survivors still alive in 2000. Average payment, about $7,500 per person, for years of slavery, for trauma, for health damage. $7,500. American companies contribute minimally. Ford contributes $13 million to various Holocaust-related funds. GM contributes indirectly through Opel. The amounts are trivial relative to company revenues. Ford's 2000 revenue, $170 billion. The $13 million contribution is 0.0076% of annual revenue. It's compensation that doesn't really compensate. It's acknowledgement without admission of responsibility. Contemporary status, 2024. The companies that were involved in Nazi Germany's industrial rise are mostly still operating. Some are among the largest corporations globally. They've issued statements acknowledging historical involvement. They've contributed to Holocaust education, memorials, compensation funds. But fundamentally, they emerged from the war economically viable and profitable. And the same mechanisms that allowed their involvement then, capital mobility, technology transfer, subsidiary structures, limited liability, still operate today. Different contexts, different countries, different industries, but the structure is the same. Capital flows globally to maximize return. Technology transfers to capture market opportunity. Subsidiaries create legal distance between parents and operations. And when things go wrong, investors face limited accountability. This isn't ancient history. This is the template of how global capitalism works. The lesson from Nazi Germany's industrial financing isn't bad people did bad things. It's normal economic mechanisms pursued rationally by normal economic actors produced catastrophic outcomes. And those mechanisms are still operating. Here's what we've established. Hitler didn't build the Nazi economy. He inherited industrial infrastructure that was built with international capital, primarily American, in the 1920s. The economic miracle of 1933 to 1939 wasn't a miracle. It was activation of existing capacity that had been idled by the Depression. Foreign corporations, GM, Ford, Standard Oil, GE, ITT, IBM, others, maintained operations in Germany through the 1930s and into the war. Not because they were ideologically Nazi, but because economic logic favored staying invested. And after the war, these corporations reclaimed their investments, received compensation for damages, and resumed profitable operations. While 70 million people died, and survivors received minimal or no compensation. So what's the philosophical question this raises? It's not, how could people be so evil? Because most of the actors weren't evil. They were rational economic actors following standard business practices. The question is, how can rational economic behavior produce catastrophic human outcomes? And the answer is structural. Economic logic optimizes for profit. It doesn't optimize for human welfare unless welfare is profitable. When the two align, when serving customers profitably also improves lives, capitalism works beautifully. But when they diverge, when profit can be made from activities that harm people, the system has no inherent brake. The brake must come externally, from regulation, from democratic governance, from moral constraint. But regulation is national, governance is local, morality is individual, while capital is global, technology is transferable, corporations are transnational. The asymmetry means economic logic often prevails over political constraint. Companies can invest in any country regardless of regime, transfer technology regardless of potential misuse, structure subsidiaries to minimize legal liability, relocate to avoid regulation, operate across borders in ways that diffuse accountability. And democratic publics operating within national boundaries have limited tools to constrain this. You can vote for politicians who promise tougher regulations, but if capital can flow to less regulated jurisdictions, the regulation just drives investment elsewhere. You can demand corporate responsibility, but if responsibility reduces profit and shareholders demand profit, corporations face pressure to minimize responsibility. The system operates according to its internal logic, and that logic is maximize return on investment, not maximize human welfare, not minimize potential harm, just maximize return. Everything else is secondary. Now here's the frightening implication. The mechanisms that finance Nazi Germany's industrial rise are still operating today. Not in Germany, not building weapons, but somewhere, building something. Capital flows to authoritarian regimes that offer profitable opportunities. Technology transfers to countries with questionable human rights records. Subsidiaries operate in legal grey areas, shielded from parent company accountability. And investors profit, while costs, environmental damage, labour exploitation, political oppression, are externalized to people who have no voice in the investment decisions. This doesn't mean every investment in every country produces Nazi-level catastrophe, but it means the structure that allowed that catastrophe still exists. And history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. The question we're left with: can global capitalism and human rights coexist? Or is there inherent tension between profit maximization and human dignity? Can we build economic systems that allocate capital efficiently without creating infrastructure that can be weaponized? Can we have technology transfer without irreversible proliferation? Can we have limited liability for investors without unlimited externalization of harm? These aren't rhetorical questions. They're the most important economic questions of our time, because the scale of potential harm is much greater now. Climate change, AI, biotechnology, nuclear technology. We're creating infrastructure with catastrophic potential. And we're doing it using the same mechanisms that financed Nazi Germany. Capital seeking return, technology transferring to opportunity, legal structures protecting investors. The same pattern, just with higher stakes. And the final philosophical point: regimes do not rise in isolation. They rise on foundations built by global finance, industrial hunger, and economic desperation. When capital seeks stability and profit, it often creates infrastructure that can be weaponized by those it never intended to empower. The profits were private, concentrated, protected. The consequences were global, distributed, uncompensated. And the builders of the system, Wall Street, industrialists, bankers, did not pay the price. 70 million people did. This is not a story about the past. It's a warning about structure, about how systems operate, about how normal people, following normal incentives, can collectively produce extraordinary evil. Not because they want to, but because the system doesn't require wanting to. It just requires following economic logic and letting consequences be someone else's problem. There's an archive in Germany, temperature controlled, carefully catalogued. Inside are Dr. Weber's records, the meticulous documentation he kept from 1924 until his death in 1944. Loan agreements, capital flows, industrial investments, trade data, all the numbers that track how American money built German industry. Historians have studied these records, written dissertations, published articles, debated details, but the numbers are clear. $2.5 billion in loans, hundreds of millions in direct investment, technology transfer worth immeasurable amounts, infrastructure built, knowledge shared, all before Hitler came to power, and all still functional when he did. In New York, there are other archives, corporate records from General Motors, Ford, Standard Oil, others. Carefully organized, legally protected. They show the same transactions from the other side. Investments made, returns expected, profits realized. No sinister plot, no conspiracy. Just business, standard business, which produced standard returns and extraordinary consequences. The documents exist side by side. German ministry records showing what was built, American corporate records showing who financed it. Together they tell a story, not of evil genius, not of master plans, but of systems. Systems that operated according to their own logic, that channeled human effort toward economic efficiency, that created infrastructure without considering who might control it, that pursued profit without weighing consequence, and that, when consequences came, protected those who profited, while abandoning those who suffered. The lesson isn't complicated, it's just uncomfortable, because it implicates all of us who participate in this system, who invest in funds that allocate capital globally, who buy products made in supply chains we don't scrutinize, who benefit from technologies whose development we don't question, who accept limited liability as normal, who assume that profit and progress are aligned. We're not building Nazi war machines, but we're using the same mechanisms, and mechanisms are neutral. They serve whoever controls them. The infrastructure we build today, AI, biotech, energy systems, financial networks, will persist. It will outlive our intentions. It will be used by people we don't choose, for purposes we don't control. And if we build it for profit without constraint, without accountability, without considering who might weaponize it, then we shouldn't be surprised when it's weaponized. The surprise isn't that it happens. The surprise is that we keep building systems this way, despite knowing the pattern, despite having seen the consequences. We keep doing it. Because the alternative, restraint, regulation, accepting lower returns for greater safety, requires sacrifices we're not willing to make. So the pattern continues. Capital flows, technology transfers, infrastructure builds, and somewhere in the future there will be archivists, cataloguing records, tracing flows, documenting how normal people, following normal incentives, collectively created something terrible. Not because they intended to, but because the system didn't require intending to. It just required participating. And we all participate.